If you saw a full-grown horse, trembling and lost in the middle of a shopping mall, would you stop? Most people didn't. Some pulled out their phones, others just hurried past. But for Frank, it was like the world froze around that one broken animal. He hadn't spoken to his daughter in years, but now something in that horse's eyes was calling him. Frank had come to the mall for a winter coat on clearance. Just another cold Tuesday in Cleveland. Just another quiet day since the funeral. His wife, Marlene, had always picked his clothes. Now everything felt like a guess. He was tired, not just from the walk, but from months of waking up to silence. He heard the hooves before he saw them, that uneven, echoing clop across the tile. Shoppers parted like water. At the end of the food court, near a shuttered smoothie stand, stood a chestnut horse, ribs showing, eyes wide with panic. It looked like it had wandered into the wrong world and realized it too late. Security guards kept their distance, radios crackling with confusion. A kid threw a piece of pizza crust and laughed. The horse flinched violently, almost crashing into a table. Frank's hand tightened around his shopping bag. He should leave. He had no reason to get involved, but his legs didn't move. The horse's mane was matted with dried mud and what looked like ice. There were sores on its back, the kind you only get from too many beatings, too little rest. Someone had used this animal hard, and then left it to fend for itself. It blinked slowly, head low, as if waiting to be struck again. Frank's heart thudded against his ribs, harder than it had in weeks. He'd been a police officer once, back when everything had meaning, back when he believed in fixing things. But nothing had prepared him for this. A starving horse in a food court too broken to run. Just like him, his daughter Josephine used to love horses. They would drive out to the country on Sundays just to feed them sugar cubes. But that was before the argument. Before the shouting, the slammed doors, the silence. It had been 5 years, and he'd never stopped missing her. A janitor tried to approach the horse with a broom, waving it like a shepherd's crook. The animal reared up, hooves flailing wildly. People screamed. Someone dropped a tray. Frank's instincts kicked in. He stepped forward slowly, palms out, ignoring the voices around him. The horse froze when it saw Frank, just for a second. Then it took one hesitant step toward him, then another. Frank could see it shaking all over, like it expected to be punished for even existing. "Easy, buddy," he whispered, not sure if he was talking to the horse or to himself. A mall cop yelled something about animal control. Someone else said they'd called the news. But Frank didn't hear any of it. He took off his coat and stretched it out like a barrier. The horse touched its nose to the fabric, and then, impossibly, let out a sound that was almost a sob. Frank could smell the horse now. Sweat, dirt, and something sour, like old fear. Its legs were trembling under its weight, and its sides heaved with each breath. Closer now, he saw an open wound near the flank, raw and red against the fur. This animal hadn't just been abandoned. It had been used up and thrown away. The mall speakers played soft jazz absurd against the moment. People had gathered, forming a cautious semicircle, recording with their phones but keeping their distance. Frank ignored them. He kept his eyes on the horse, speaking low, steady words like he would with a panicked child. He'd once talked a man down from a rooftop. That had been the hardest day of his career, until now. Because that man had words, this horse had only pain and fear. And somehow, Frank knew that if he turned away now, this creature would give up for good. Animal control arrived. A young woman and an older man in a battered truck with a cage in the back. They brought ropes, gloves, and a tranquilizer rifle. "He's unpredictable," the older man said, scanning the crowd. "We'll have to sedate him to get him out safely." "No," Frank said sharply, surprising even himself. "Give me a minute." The woman frowned, hesitant. "Sir, he's agitated. You're not trained for this." Frank didn't answer. He kept one hand stretched toward the horse, which hadn't moved an inch since touching his coat. The horse's eyes tracked him with slow recognition. Not trust yet, but something softer than terror. "I know what it's like to be left behind," Frank whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "I know what it's like to wait for someone who's never coming back." There was blood on the horse's right hoof, dried and crusted. A brand scar on the shoulder, someone's initials burned into its skin. Whoever had done this didn't care if it lived or died. Frank's fists clenched. He looked around and realized something terrifying. Nobody was going to step in unless he did. "Back up," he said to the crowd. No flashes. No noise. For once, people listened. Maybe it was the way he spoke, or the gravity in his face. The mall fell into an uneasy hush, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the wheeze of the horses breathing. The animal control officer gave him 10 minutes. "After that, we take it down," the older man warned. Frank nodded, knowing full well what that meant. He could already picture the horse collapsing mid-step, alone and confused. That couldn't happen. Not while he was here. Frank took another slow step forward. The horse didn't flinch this time. It looked at him, really looked, and in that moment, something broke open between them. A silent understanding passed like a current in the air. Frank reached out with one hand, and the horse leaned into it. The horse let out a deep, shuddering breath, almost like relief. Frank gently placed his coat over its back, careful not to touch the wound. It didn't pull away. It just stood there, trembling, as if it had been waiting years for someone to touch it, without hurting it. The crowd watched in stunned silence. With help from the younger officer, Frank began leading the horse out of the mall. Each step echoed like a heartbeat. The animal walked slowly, head low but no longer frantic. Frank whispered to it the whole time, stories from his past, names he hadn't spoken in years, like Josephine. Outside, snow was falling in heavy flakes. The horse stopped at the entrance, nostrils flaring in the cold. For a moment, Frank feared it would bolt. But instead, it took one cautious step forward, and then another, like it had chosen to follow him, chosen to trust him. They loaded it into the truck gently. The younger officer rode in back with it, monitoring its breathing. "You did something special in there," she told Frank. He just nodded, brushing snow from his sleeves. His hands were still shaking, but for the first time in a long time it wasn't from fear. At the shelter, the vet was blunt. Severely malnourished, dehydrated, might have pneumonia. Whoever had him before didn't care about survival. She paused, glancing at Frank. "We'll do what we can, but he needs more than medicine. He needs someone present." Frank didn't hesitate. "I'll stay." They set up a cot in the barn. The shelter staff were surprised, but didn't argue. Frank sat beside the stall that night, wrapped in an old quilt, watching the horse twitch in its sleep. He named him Chester, after the town where he'd grown up, back when life was simpler. Days turned into a week. Chester began to eat slowly at first, then with more strength. He'd whinny when Frank entered the barn, eyes brighter now. He still flinched at sudden sounds, but he no longer shrank from touch. Frank read aloud to him every evening, old letters, newspapers, even poems. Word spread about the mall rescue. Local news did a segment, and people started sending blankets, feed, and donations to the shelter. A teenage girl dropped off a handmade halter, embroidered with, "You are safe now." Frank thanked her, his voice cracking halfway through. The shelter director asked if he wanted to adopt Chester. "He seems to think you're his person." Frank looked at the horse, no longer broken, but still healing. "He saved me too," he said quietly. "We've got unfinished business. Him and I." One afternoon, while brushing Chester, Frank's phone buzzed with a number he hadn't seen in 5 years. His hand froze. He answered. A voice, soft, familiar, said, "Dad, I saw you on the news." There was a long pause. "Can I come see him?" Frank looked at Chester, tears welling. "Yeah," he whispered. We'd like that." Josephine arrived the next morning, her boots crunching through the snow as she stepped into the barn. She froze when she saw Frank, older, tired, but standing taller than she remembered. And then she saw Chester, who stepped forward and nudged her gently, like he already knew her pain. They didn't say much at first. Frank handed her a brush, and they worked in silence, side by side. The rhythm of it, long strokes down Chester's back, did more than words could. Eventually, Josephine smiled. "You always said horses were better listeners than people," Frank chuckled. Still true. Chester's recovery became a kind of shared mission. Josephine started visiting weekly. They fixed the old paddock behind Frank's house, where Chester could roam freely. Each nail they hammered, each fence they repaired, seemed to stitch something back together. Between father and daughter, Frank learned to cook for two again. He made stew when Josephine stayed late, like Marlene used to. Chester would poke his head through the window, demanding an apple. The house wasn't quiet anymore, not with laughter, not with hooves clopping just outside the door. One day, a school contacted Frank, asking if Chester could visit their special ed program. The kids read better when animals are around, the teacher explained. Chester was gentle, still cautious, but patient in a way few humans could be, Frank agreed. And Chester shined. Together, they started visiting more schools, then rehab centers, then a women's shelter. People responded to Chester's quiet strength, to the way he lowered his head and listened. Frank never called it therapy, but somehow it always felt like healing for everyone involved. Josephine eventually brought her own daughter, Sophie, who giggled every time Chester licked her hand. Frank watched them from the porch, a quiet joy settling in his chest. There was a time he thought he'd live out his days in silence. Now, there were tiny boots by the door. Frank kept Chester's first coat, the one from the mall, in the barn, folded neatly on a shelf. Every now and then, he'd hold it and remember the moment it all changed. The moment he stopped running from his grief and walked straight into it, with a horse at his side. The shelter invited Frank to speak at a fundraiser. He stood before the crowd, nervous, holding a photo of Chester the day they met. "He didn't just survive," he said. "He made me want to live again." The audience rose to their feet, some in tears. Chester stood beside him, calm and proud. Frank reached down and touched Chester's neck gently. "I thought I rescued a horse," he said, voice low but steady. "But really, I just met the one soul who understood how lost I was." And with that, they walked off stage not as a man and a horse, but as two survivors finally home.